crystal is some material whose measurable properties are periodic in space. That is, if the material has a particular property at one point, then at some specific point, just a little bit further over, it will have exactly the same property. And if we go just the same amount further over again, we will again find exactly the same property. A crystal structure is a structure that can fill all space by the regular stacking of identical blocks, or what we sometimes call unit cells. It's particularly important here that this stacking of these identical blocks or unit cells will fill all space. There must be no gaps between these blocks or unit cells. Here's a picture of what we might call a rectangular crystal structure or lattice. There's a series of dots here. We've drawn them connected by lines, and these dots are obviously equally spaced in this direction, and then again they're equally spaced by another amount in this other direction down here. The crystal lattice is what we get if we put a mark, such as these various points here, at the same spot on the surface of each block. So here you might imagine these dots are at the corners of the blocks. We could instead imagine we put some dot in the middle of each block and put it at the same place in every block. Then these spots that we have written onto every block in the same place form what is called a crystal lattice. So the lattice is really a collection of points that are equally spaced in this specific kind of way. There are many examples of such crystalline structures in the everyday world. Large-scale examples include wallpaper, which is usually a pattern of repeated blocks or units of some kind or other. Bricks in a brick wall are usually put together in a periodic fashion over any large plain wall surface. Tiles on a wall or on a floor or a ceiling are often in regular patterns of repeating units, sometimes just of one tile or sometimes of groups of tiles. The architecture of some modern large buildings, such as hotels, for example, are often repetitions of the same unit many times in a regular pattern. Examples also exist in nature, such as the honeycombs constructed by bees. Sometimes we use these patterns simply because we may like how they look, but often we're using them to simplify the design and also to make the behavior predictable. For example, if we didn't put our bricks in a regular pattern when making a wall, we might get weak spots in the wall. Crystalline materials are made from repeating units involving one or perhaps more than one atoms per unit. We use them for several reasons that are similar to our macroscopic examples. They're relatively simple to understand. We can actually even persuade nature to make them for us in crystal growth. And under many kinds of conditions, many materials will naturally form into crystalline structures. The regular nature of such crystals helps make their behavior quite predictable. That predictability is very useful when we want to manufacture with high yield. And their behavior often gives our devices very high performance. Electrons can move very easily through crystalline materials, for example. As we change the wavelength or color of light that we shine in some crystalline semiconductors, near some very specific wavelength, the material may change from being quite absorbing for one band of colors to being quite transparent for other bands of colors. For crystalline materials, the change from the absorbing to the transmitting can occur quite abruptly as we change the color of the light. That abruptness often turns out to be at the core of high performance in optoelectronic devices, especially in light emitters and some light modulators. So let's look at some crystalline structures for atoms or groups of atoms. We can talk about lattice vectors. The set of lattice vectors consists of all of the possible vectors we could draw here that consist of integer numbers of one particular vector, for example a1 here, integer numbers of a second particular vector, for example a2, And if we had a three-dimensional lattice, integer numbers of a third little vector here, A3. And these crystal lattice vectors that we're talking about here link the same point in two different unit cells of the crystal. Translating, or moving sideways as it were, by a lattice vector makes no difference to anything because the crystal looks exactly the same here as it did down there. And that is sometimes called translational symmetry. The crystal looks exactly the same if we move it or translate it by any of these possible lattice vectors. And the lattice vectors are vectors that join any one point in the crystal lattice to any other specific point in the crystal lattice. In this lattice vector then, which we could call, say, RL, A1, A2, and A3 for a three-dimensional lattice are three linearly independent vectors, that is, vectors that don't point in the same directions as one another, and these vectors take us from a point in one unit cell, say here, to the equivalent point in the adjacent unit cell, say here. So the A1 vector would take us from here to here, or from the middle of this cell to the middle of this cell. Similarly, the A2 vector would take us from this point in this cell to the same point in the adjacent cell in this direction. It turns out that when we look at possible kinds of these lattices of points, for example, in a given dimensionality, such as one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional, there are only specific finite numbers of different types or symmetries of these lattices of points. And by that we don't mean the separation between the points in the lattices, we rather mean the geometrical arrangement in terms of the symmetries of the points. Can we reflect the whole lattice about some plane? Can we rotate it round some axis? And similarly. And these are called Bravais lattices. In one dimension, this is all very trivial. There's only one kind of Bravais lattice, and that's just equally spaced points along some direction. In two dimensions, it turns out there are only 5 possible different kinds of these Bravais lattices of points. And in particular, something that is perhaps a little surprising at first, for example, there is no 5-sided object or unit cell that can be repeated to fill all space in a plane. Now, it's quite possible to use rectangles all the same size, stacked side by side to fill all of a plane, and we could certainly use squares, and we could also use hexagons side by side to fill an entire plane. But we cannot do that, strangely enough, for any 5-sided object, and that's an example of a kind of lattice that simply doesn't exist. In 3 dimensions, it turns out there are 14 different kinds of possible Bravais lattices. We won't here have time to look at all of these, and we'll concentrate, just as an example, on some of the more simple and more useful lattices, specifically some of the cubic lattices, for example. One particularly important class of lattices are called diamond and zinc blende lattices. Zinc blende is a historical name for zinc sulfide crystallized in a specific form that we find in nature. A large fraction of the semiconductor materials of practical interest, such as silicon or germanium, and most of the so-called 3-5 semiconductors, which includes technologically important materials like gallium arsenide and some of its various cousins, made from group 3 elements like gallium and group 5 elements like arsenic. And also many, but not all, of the 2-6 materials, semiconductor materials, such as zinc, which is a group 2, and selenium, so zinc selenide, selenium is a group 6. These kinds of 3-5 and 2-6 materials often, but not always, form in this so-called zinc blende lattice. And this is a specific type of cubic lattice. The diamond and the zinc blend are very closely related, as we will see, and both have the same underlying form of cubic lattice. So here's a picture of this lattice. In this lattice, we've drawn two different kinds of atoms. We've drawn red atoms, and we've drawn blue atoms. In this picture, by the way, these lines here, which outline a cube, we should not look upon as being physically real, in that they are not generally bond lines between atoms. But these lines in this picture that go between red ones and blue ones are essentially the bond lines connecting atoms. Now, as I've said, there are two different kinds of atoms drawn in this lattice here. The Bravais lattice, corresponding to this lattice that we see here, this physical lattice of atoms, is what's called face-centered cubic. And that's relatively clear to see if we look at the positions of all of these red atoms here. So we see atoms at the corners of this cube, at every corner of this cube that we've drawn with these mathematical lines, which, as I said, are not generally chemical bond lines. And then you also see that there are red atoms in the middle of each face of the cube. And there's also one right at the back there. So if you look only at the red atoms, you see atoms on the corners of a cube and in the middle of each face of that cube. Now, a strange thing about this, which is not obvious from this diagram, is that these blue atoms are also on a face-centered cubic lattice. That is, if we were to extend this picture, we would see also that the blue atoms lie on the corners of a cube and on the faces of a cube. And that cube would be displaced from this one we've drawn here by one bond length along this direction, for example, or along any of the other directions connecting the red and the blue atoms. The actual physical lattice here, then, has two interlocking face-centered cubic lattices, the lattice of the red atoms in a face-centered cubic form, and the lattice of the blue atoms, also, as it turns out, in a face-centered cubic form. And this face-centered cubic lattice is the Bravais lattice. The Bravais lattice is not the two interlocking face-centered cubic lattices. The Bravais lattice is just a face-centered cubic lattice. And the way to think of this is that one pair of atoms is associated with each point of the Bravais lattice. So this crystal form here actually has a lower symmetry than the face-centered cubic lattice. The face-centered cubic lattice has some reflection symmetries that don't exist for this pair of interlocking face-centered cubic lattices. And we think of this pair of atoms, for example, as being what sits on a lattice point. And this pair of atoms has got a specific orientation, which reduces the symmetry of the system compared to the underlying Bravais lattice. As I said, zinc blende is the crystal structure for zinc sulfide, and it's a crystal structure for most of the 3,5 and 2,6 materials, but not quite all of them. And as I said, in these kinds of lattices, all of one kind of atom, for example, the group 3 atom or the group 2 atom for the 2,6s, all of those atoms lie on one face-centered cubic lattice, and the group 5 for the 3,5s or the group 6 for the 2,6s lies on the other face-centered cubic lattice that is interlocking here. The diamond lattice looks exactly the same as this, and it's found in some group 4 materials such as silicon and germanium, and some forms of carbon. Specifically, diamond itself is in a diamond lattice, and some forms of tin, which is also a group 4 material. In this case, both interlocking lattices have the same kinds of atoms on them. So in the diamond lattice for carbon, the red and the blue atoms are both carbon atoms, for example. And similarly, in the diamond lattice for silicon, the red and the blue atoms are both silicon, and so on. Here is a model of part of a zinc blende lattice. When we look at this form without the edges of the cube that's implicit in this structure marked, it's actually not really obvious that this lattice bears any relation to a cube. The bonds between the atoms, here given by these little transparent plastic tubes, don't lie on the cube edges, so the cube shape is not at all obvious here. We're more likely just to notice that the little yellow atoms here are connected to 4 of the grey neighbours in a shape that is like a kind of a pyramid. It's a regular tetragonal shape, if you like, of this connection of all of these bonds between the yellow ones and the grey ones. But indeed, this particular kind of lattice does have a face-centred cubic form, as we've seen in our pictures so far. There are other important lattice structures in semiconductors that occur often in modern devices. Hexagonal is a lattice form that you see in the graphite form of carbon. That's the form of carbon in ordinary pencil lead. And if you peel off sheets from the graphite, you get what's called graphene, which has become of great scientific interest recently. Graphene is a sheet of carbon atoms formed in a hexagonal lattice. And this hexagonal lattice, this graphene sheet, if you roll it up, it gives you carbon nanotubes, which have also been of a lot of scientific interest lately. So those are rolled up sheets of hexagonal carbon atoms. Wurtzite is another lattice structure that both 2,6 and 3,5 materials can exist in, and it's a form of hexagonal lattice with 2 atoms per lattice point. This is the lattice structure for gallium nitride in most of the forms in which we see it, and gallium nitride currently forms the basis for many of our white light-emitting diodes. So let's summarize some key points about crystals. Crystals are made up from unit cells, which are identical mathematical bricks, stacked regularly side by side to fill all space with no gaps between the bricks. The absence of any spaces between the bricks is mathematically important in the definition of crystals. Crystals also have the property of translational symmetry of the underlying lattice. That is, translating or moving the crystal by any lattice vector makes no difference to anything measurable. Crystals can have what we could call lower symmetry, but never higher symmetry than the underlying lattice. For example, the zinc blende lattice is based on a face-centered cubic lattice. However, because we have an oriented pair of 2 different atoms associated with each lattice point, this lattice does not have all of the reflection symmetries, for example, of the face-centered cubic lattice. However, the zinc blende lattice does have the translational symmetries of the underlying face-centered cubic lattice. The symmetry of crystals is understood mathematically from group theory, which is very useful for understanding all such symmetries, though this is beyond our discussion here.